Everyone wants the Griffith question to have one clean answer. Was Griffith always a monster? Or did the world break a man who could have been something else? The easy answer is to pick a side and defend it with emotion. He was evil from the start. No, he was a victim of trauma. But Griffith is more disturbing than either answer, because both sides are partly right. And both sides become wrong when they try to explain everything. So let's separate two things people usually mix together: capacity and choice. Was Griffith always capable of becoming Femto? Yes. Does that mean the Eclipse changed nothing? No. That distinction is the whole argument. Because the real question is not just whether Griffith had darkness inside him. Most people have darkness inside them. The real question is whether Griffith built a life where, under enough pressure, that darkness would become useful. And that is what makes him terrifying. Not that he was born as Femto, but that becoming Femto made sense according to values he already had. Start with the case against him. Before the torture. Before the Eclipse. Before the God Hand. Griffith already has a dangerous moral structure. He is not some innocent idealist who gets corrupted by power. He is a man with a dream so absolute that every other value has to orbit around it. His soldiers matter to him. That part is important. He is not emotionally empty. He does grieve. He does carry guilt. He does understand that real people are dying for him. But here's the darker part. Their deaths do not make him stop. They make him continue. That is the logic Griffith lives by. If people have already died for the dream, then abandoning the dream would make those deaths meaningless. So every corpse behind him becomes another reason to keep walking forward. Guilt does not interrupt the dream. Guilt becomes fuel for the dream. He does not simply ignore the dead. He carries them. But the way he carries them is horrifying. Their deaths become a contract. If they died for him, then he must succeed. If he fails, then their deaths were just deaths. So the more blood the dream costs, the more impossible it becomes for him to abandon it. That is not simple evil. It is worse than simple evil. Because it can look noble from the outside. A selfish man might use people and feel nothing. Griffith uses people, feels the weight of it, and then turns that weight into justification. That is the first warning sign. Not that he feels nothing, but that even his guilt eventually serves the dream. The second warning sign is guts. People often point to guts as proof that Griffith could love someone, and they are right. Griffith's attachment to guts is real. That is exactly why it matters. Because Guts is the one person who starts to become more than a tool, more than a soldier, more than another piece on the board. Guts becomes someone Griffith cannot fully control. And Griffith's own idea of friendship makes this even sharper. He says, in essence, that a true friend is not someone who simply follows another man's dream. A true friend is someone with his own reason to live, someone who can stand beside him as an equal. That is what makes the scene so brutal in hindsight. Griffith describes a true friend as someone who does not merely live inside another man's dream. And Guts hears that. Guts does not leave because he hates Griffith. He does not leave because he wants to destroy the Band of the Hawk. He leaves because, by Griffith's own standard, leaving is the only way he could ever stand beside him. Then Guts actually tries to do that, and Griffith cannot bear it. That is the contradiction at the center of him. He respects the idea of an equal, but emotionally, he cannot tolerate the reality of one. When Guts leaves, Griffith does not respond like a calm leader losing a soldier. He collapses. He makes a reckless decision. He goes to Charlotte, not as some master plan, but as an impulsive attempt to recover control after the one person he could not possess walked away. And that night matters, because it is one of the rare moments where Griffith is not acting like a strategist. He is not advancing the dream. He is reacting to humiliation. He is reacting to powerlessness. For once, the man who turns everything into a step toward the castle does something reckless, emotional, and self-destructive. And that tells us something crucial. Griffith's problem is not that he feels nothing. His problem is that when feeling threatens the dream, he would rather destroy himself than accept powerlessness. So the first side of the argument is strong. The flaw exists before the torture, before the eclipse, before the supernatural offer. Griffith's dream is not only ambition, it is identity, it is control. It is the thing that tells him who he is. The eclipse did not invent Griffith's values. It exposed the final consequence of values he already had. If the dream comes first, and people matter only inside the dream, then there is always a hidden question waiting underneath everything. What happens if the dream and the people finally stand against each other? The eclipse answers that question. And this is why the "he was always innocent until the world ruined him" argument cannot fully work. Because the dream was already above the people. The hierarchy was already there. The eclipse did not create the hierarchy. It revealed it. But that is not the whole story. And if we stop here, we make Griffith too simple. We turn him into a monster wearing a human costume. And that is not what makes him disturbing. What makes Griffith disturbing is that the human part was real. The dream was real. The guilt was real. The bond with Guts was real. And still, when everything collapsed, those things were not enough. Because if you say Griffith was always just a monster, you miss what makes him tragic. A pure monster does not need to grieve. A pure monster does not need to be persuaded. A pure monster does not need a vision of the dead telling him that turning back would make every sacrifice meaningless. Griffith is not frightening because he never cared. He is frightening because he cared. But not enough to stop. That is the strongest argument for the other side. Griffith is not the same person after his fall. That is not an excuse. It is just true. After Guts leaves, Griffith loses almost everything that made Griffith possible. His status is gone. His army is destroyed. His future is gone. His body is broken. His voice is taken. His ability to act, command, charm, fight, or even perform the identity he built for himself is stripped away. This is not just suffering. It is identity death. Griffith's entire self was built around movement toward the castle, around becoming something, around making the dream real. After the torture, he is still conscious, but the person he knows himself to be can no longer exist. He is alive, but the dream is functionally dead. And if the dream is the load-bearing wall of his identity, then once it collapses, there is almost nothing left holding him together. So the second side is also strong. The eclipse is not Griffith casually showing his true face. It is Griffith at the point of total collapse, offered the one impossible path back to the only self he ever believed in. That matters. Trauma does not create morality from nothing, but it can destroy the parts of a person that used to restrain them. It can narrow the world until only one desire remains visible. In Griffith's case, that desire is the dream. So no, the world did not create the ambition, but the world did destroy almost everything that had been competing with it. And this is where the God Hand matters. Because the God Hand does not need to invent a new Griffith. That is what makes the scenes so disturbing. They do not say, "Become something you never were." They show him a version of his own logic taken to its final endpoint. They take the guilt he already carries, the dream he already worships, the corpses already behind him, the future he believes he has lost, and then they arrange all of it into one conclusion. If you stop now, it was all for nothing. That is manipulation. Absolutely. But it works because it is built out of Griffith's own beliefs. They do not force him to love the dream. He already loves it. They do not force him to measure the dead against the castle. He has been doing that for years. They do not create his fear of powerlessness. they exploit it. That distinction matters, because manipulation can explain why a person is vulnerable. It can explain why the offer appears at the worst possible moment. It can explain why the choice is framed in the cruelest possible way. But manipulation is not the same thing as innocence. The God hand opens the door. They decorate the door. They make the door look like destiny. But Griffith still has to walk through it. Now test both sides. The "he was always a monster" argument has one major problem. Griffith's guilt is real. His attachment to Guts is real. His grief over the dead is real. If people were only fuel to him, there would be no inner conflict. But there is conflict. The tragedy works because there is something human there to lose. If Griffith were simply empty from the beginning, the eclipse would not feel like a fall. It would only feel like a reveal. But it is a fall, and that matters. However, the world made him do it argument has an even bigger problem. The sacrifice is still a choice. A manipulated choice, yes. A choice made in despair, yes. A choice offered by inhuman beings in the most extreme psychological condition imaginable, yes. But still a choice. And Griffith understands what is being asked of him. The Band of the Hawk is not an abstract price. They are the people who followed him, trusted him, fought for him, and built his dream with their bodies. He does not sacrifice strangers. He sacrifices the people who chose him. That is why the decision cannot be explained away as trauma. Trauma explains why he is vulnerable to the offer. It does not explain why he accepts that his dream is worth more than everyone who made it possible. And this is the line people sometimes blur. To explain Griffith is not to excuse Griffith. To understand the pressure on him is not to remove the choice from him. The pressure tells us why the door appeared. The choice tells us who walked through it. And what happens after the sacrifice makes the defense even weaker. Because the eclipse is not just survival. It is not just, "I had no other way to continue." The cruelty that follows, especially toward Guts and Casca, cannot be reduced to strategic necessity. It is personal. It is punitive. It is Griffith asserting power over the two people most connected to the part of him that had failed. And this is where any sympathetic reading of Griffith has to stop being careful and start being honest. The violence against Casca is not part of some tragic necessity. It does not rebuild the dream. It does not save him. It does not restore the band. It does not need to happen for Griffith to become Femto. It is an assertion of power. It is Griffith proving, in the cruelest possible way, that the bonds which once made him vulnerable no longer have authority over him. That is where the broken victim reading hits its limit. Pain can explain collapse. It cannot absolve domination. And this is why Griffith remains responsible. Not because his suffering was fake, not because the manipulation was fake, not because the trauma did not matter, but because none of those things erase what he did with the power he was given. A victim can still become a perpetrator. A broken person can still make a monstrous choice. And understanding the wound does not mean pretending the wound chose for him. So here is the answer that holds up best. Griffith was not always Femto, but Griffith was always the kind of person who could become Femto if the dream demanded it. The monster was not fully visible from the beginning. It was not walking around openly in a white cape, waiting for an excuse. There was real humanity in him, real grief, real attachment, real beauty even. But underneath all of that was a hierarchy, the dream at the top, everyone else below it. And the eclipse is the moment that hierarchy becomes undeniable. That is why Griffith is not just a villain, and not just a victim. He is what happens when a person builds his entire identity around one absolute goal then chooses that goal over every human bond that ever gave it meaning. The world broke him, but it did not choose for him. The God hand offered him a door. Despair pushed him toward it, but Griffith walked through. And that is the uncomfortable part, the part people keep arguing about because it does not let anyone feel clean. If he were always a monster, there would be no tragedy. If he were only a victim, there would be no guilt. But Griffith is guilty because he was human enough to know the cost, and still chose to pay it with other people's lives. So no, I do not think Griffith was born evil. I think he became unforgivable for a much more disturbing reason. He had a dream so sacred to him that when the final choice came, humanity itself became negotiable. And once humanity is negotiable, the monster does not need to be forced out. It only needs permission. That is Griffith, not a man who never had humanity, but a man who found the one thing he valued more.